This is Duke University.
I'm Fritz Mayer. I'm director of POLIS, the Center for Political Leadership, Innovation, and Service. Also very involved in the Policy Bridge initiative at Duke, which has really supported this effort. This is finding common ground in a polarized world, and an amazingly topical issue at the moment. And joining me today are John Hood, who is the president of the John William Pope Foundation and chair of the board of the John Locke Foundation, former journalist, but now prolific commentator, blogger, author, and also foundation director, involved really in conservative political circles in North Carolina, a prominent figure in the discourse here in the state of North Carolina. And also joining us today is Leslie Winter, former civil rights attorney, former state senator from Charlotte, a Democrat, lots of former executive director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which is a very prominent North Carolina foundation, which tends to be a good deal more liberal than the Pope Foundation. And so John and Leslie in some ways embody something that we're really trying to do here at Duke, which is to find ways to talk to each other across divides. The two of them and I've been involved with an initiative called the North Carolina Leadership Forum. And that's something we set up about a little over a year ago that involves 30 or so very high-level leaders in North Carolina, politicians, business leaders, foundation heads, across the political divide, people who, many of them at least knew each other, but really don't talk to each other that much anymore. And we've had 5 full one-day meetings, most of them here at Duke, to talk about an important issue facing North Carolina, how to help more North Carolinians earn enough to support their families. And it's been a fascinating exercise. I think we've all learned something from that experience about what works and maybe some things about how we could do that better. But I think the bottom line is it's given us confidence that it is still possible, and it is worth doing to have these kinds of conversations. So we're going to engage. I'll engage a little bit with John and Leslie, and then we'll open up for conversations with you about the issue. I could just say very briefly. I mean, it's hard to. Certainly in my lifetime, I can't. There's not been a moment when we've been as polarized as we are today. We could look at the 60s perhaps, and I was alive in the 60s, but certainly since that time it's hard to find a moment where we're as divided as we are. We're divided by party, by race, by gender. I mean, some have called it the great sorting, that we're sorted out into separate worlds, and many have commented on the fact that we live in separate media environments, that we have different sets of facts at our disposal, that we are living in bubbles, that we hear from and talk to people who are only like ourselves. And there's recently been, not just that we're separate, but there's kind of an edge to the conversation, to the extent there is one, a tendency to demonize the other side, to shut people out, not to listen. And this is just, from our perspective, dangerous territory for democracy that depends at the end, if not on agreeing, and we're not always going to agree on things, but at least having a common commitment to respecting the process, respecting the conversation, being open to learning from others, having a certain kind of humility even. And so, you, like all of us, have been a bit alarmed, even not just in the context of this most recent election, but even prior to that, about the state of political discourse and the great division. So that's sort of the animating problem that all of us, or the three of us, have been interested in working on and have been working on in the context of North Carolina. So let me start just by asking perhaps each of you to maybe pick up on the things that I've said in terms of your own sense of the nature of the problem that led us, and really John and Leslie first had this idea of a forum of this kind that led the two of you to think that we really needed something like this North Carolina Forum or other fora to begin to create spaces to get people back into the same room to have an opportunity to have a conversation. What was it? You've both been on the scene in North Carolina quite a while. You've observed the changes. Why now? Why is this something that needed to happen? Leslie, let me start with you.
So, when I was in the legislature in the 1990s, I was a Democrat in the Senate, and the Senate was majority Democrat, but the House was majority Republican. And it was not true that we agreed on everything. We disagreed on many things. But we did manage to work together to forge solutions that we thought were good, basically good for the people of North Carolina, and that somehow we all felt comfortable living with. And we didn't really personalize things. We did disagree, but we didn't call the other person the enemy or evil. And somehow, since then, and for many reasons, a lot has been written about this, that has changed dramatically. So in the fall of 2014, I read an article that John had written about the phenomenon of our separate news sources and how we're not just siloed in terms of what opinions we're exposed to, we're actually siloed in terms of what facts we're exposed to. We don't see the same infographics. So I thought, I don't really agree with John on almost anything, but I agree with him about this, and I'm going to go talk to him. And interestingly, even though both of us have been in politics and around politics in North Carolina for a long time, we'd never really had a conversation with each other. So I made an appointment, I went and talked to him, and it did take us a few months to decide that we trusted each other enough to move forward with this project together. But we did eventually decide that it really was important for the future of the state for people who sincerely, honestly disagreed with each other to have a place that we could listen to each other's opinions and what was underneath those opinions, and see if there was some little piece of turf that we could all stand on together, and in the process perhaps form some relationships and take a few horns off of people. So fortuitously I sat next to Fritz at a dinner at Joel Fleischman's house, and he said Sanford's trying to think about some ways to be more helpful to policy making in North Carolina, and do you have any ideas? And I said, yeah, I do happen to have an idea. And he and John and I assumed that, and I'll let John take over from here.
John?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to tell this story and see what y'all think about it a little bit more. As Leslie said, we had a similar motivation, we had a similar diagnosis of the problem, and also similarly weren't quite sure what to do about it. If it was easy to solve, somebody who spotted it earlier and is more brilliant than we are would have already solved it, so we were not at sea without a rudder, but we were certainly at a sea without adequate navigational charts. So we decided to try something and learn from it as we go. And so the development of the North Carolina Leadership Forum, which took a number of months of meeting, assembling a steering committee that included some other people who shared our interest. Anita Brown Graham, who was at the time the director of Emerging Issues, the Institute for Emerging Issues at NC State. Chuck Neely, who had served in the House as a Republican lawyer when Leslie was in the Senate as a Democratic lawyer. and some others to really talk through what we wanted to do, and in particular to avoid what we thought, I think accurately, were some obvious traps in this kind of process. One of them is something that you and I, we all know, is that it was always better in the good old days. It could be, we could be talking about schools, we could be talking about the economy, we could be talking about politics, we could be talking about civil discourse, but we all have this tendency to romanticize our own past, to remember the good parts of the past, and we didn't want to get too carried away with that. Like it used to be that everybody was very polite and respectful, no one ever accused each other of bad motives, and everybody got along really, really swimmingly well, and then the young people came around and screwed it up, or whatever the version of your story is. We wanted to avoid that by recognizing that the changes that we witness, the changes that affect the discourse, have positive and negative effects, like the internet, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the other thing we wanted to avoid is a kind of an obvious trap, an obvious way these kinds of dialogues often go is, you know, the problem is we're really more alike than we think, and if we would just meet each other, we would find out that we don't have that much, we have so much in common and not very much that we really disagree about. I don't think that's empirically correct. And I also think if you go into a conversation assuming the real problem is, I mean, you know what you're talking about, but the other person just hasn't been exposed to the truth. You know, a couple of good conversations. I know you've never really heard of the free market, Fritz. Let me tell you about the free market. And then suddenly we would all agree. And so we knew that those kinds of romanticizing the past and sort of romanticizing the outcome of a conversation was something we wanted to avoid. So we went into the leadership forum by devising the topic, devising the list of people we would invite, with our goal not to form a consensus about a 5-point plan to address North Carolina's poverty problem. There are lots of different groups and individuals and coalitions and projects that are developing 5-point plans and 10-point plans and legislative strategies, and that really wasn't our goal. Now, if we were to find some things that virtually all or all of us agreed about, we wanted to note that and hold that out, and that certainly could influence the public policy conversation. But it wasn't so much about a policy agenda as it was about people really leaving this process knowing a great deal more about what other people think, why they think it, why these political differences arise, not trying to wish them away, but really figuring out a way to talk, to do a much harder thing, which is to have a civil dialogue across persistent and even unbridgeable differences, as opposed to a civil dialogue to lead to consensus, which is easier and frankly not as likely. So that was the thinking that we had, and in the setting up of this particular iteration of the North Carolina Leadership Forum with a series of meetings on a particular topic, we wanted to talk about our differences. It turns out you really don't succeed if you and I are going to go meet and let's talk about our differences. You have to have something to chew on. You have to have a topic to talk about. That's why we chose the topic that we did. It wasn't that, I mean, any other topic would have been helpful too. We had to have a topic. You have to have something to chew on, and that's what we did. And we chose a topic that was very broad, very big, and that lots of people cared about a great deal. And I think it was wise to choose a fairly broad topic and a topic that engendered lots of passions. But in retrospect, it was really broad. And perhaps as we proceed forward, we might choose topics that are a little bit more directed, a little narrower enough that we can really get our hands around it over the course of several meetings.
Maybe we could talk just a little bit more about the process. So if you described a little bit the composition of the people, the fact that it was a very broad topic. There are also some other, you set up something like this, you've got some very serious people, and you're asking them to give up a lot of time. You want to use their time well. I think we basically did that well. We certainly learned some things, and as John is alluding, the hope here is that this isn't the last of these, that we will continue on. We have funding for another cycle now, and we're intent that this become an institution in North Carolina where hundreds of people will have gone through this kind of thing. And hopefully also spawn some others. But just in terms of the design of this one, I mean, one of the things, just to point to two things actually. One was that the meetings were under what is called Chatham House rules, which is that you can talk outside about the conversation, but not attribute any comments that are made there, so that people could speak freely in the room. And that was one key feature of this. And we could perhaps talk to, there's some big pros to that, there's some cons to that too as well. And the other is that we began with some basic facts. We didn't jump to what should we do about the minimum wage or any other particular hot issue, but rather said, can we agree on some basic facts? Can we agree about the magnitude of the challenge facing North Carolinians who are in terms of how much they earn and whether or not they can support their families. Because we do live in different fact worlds, and to be honest, people just don't know the facts. And so we spent maybe more than we needed, but we spent a couple of sessions just trying to get to a kind of common fact basis. And so I'm going to point to those two things as features of the design, and maybe get you to comment on why we did that and whether that worked, and all of which is in service of that. We're trying to learn how to do this better and to be and hopefully to be a model for others who might try to do this kind of thing. But Leslie, what?
So along with fact gathering, the very first thing we did was Duke produced some really great videos of some interviews with people who are employed full-time or are employed, and so also some employers, about why they or their employees aren't earning enough to support their families. So we had a healthcare worker from Greensboro, I believe, I can't remember exactly, maybe High Point, who had numerous part-time jobs and was living in her car and talking to her kids and grandkids, on her iPhone instead of visiting them because she was going from job to job. There was a firefighter, I think that was the most surprising one to me, who couldn't support his family on his wages as a firefighter, and had also numerous other kind of extra moonlighting jobs. But also an employer who talked about how government regulation stopped him from expanding his workforce. So I think that policy making by anecdote is dangerous, but personalizing and humanizing this problem was a good way to get us to get into the conversation of what we thought the basis of the problem was and who was responsible for solving it. So some people thought it was, the problem was societal, not enough community colleges, or not a proper wage structure. Some people thought it was all individual responsibility, that people didn't take enough responsibility for themselves, for their families. That was, I think, a really important and kind of personal way for us to wade into this difficult discussion. And in that meeting, we learned that really, while some people thought this is really an individual responsibility problem, and some people thought this is really a failure of societal institutions problem, none of us thought either of those things exclusively. All of us were somewhere on the spectrum, and somebody may be more over here and somebody else might be more over here. But in the end, everybody thought that individuals had some self-responsibility, some responsibility for their families, and that society had some responsibility. So I thought that was a very good and, in some ways, non-threatening way to start diving into the topic. I thought the other thing that was very interesting was, our question was, what can we do to enable people to earn enough to support their families? So what does enough mean? And people didn't come in with a very clear idea of that. And Ryan Smith, who works with Fritz, developed this great cost of living calculator that you can play with on the Sanford Schools website now, that used Durham and also I think it was Halifax or one of the Northeast counties, and let you decide what kinds of things you thought people should have and how much they cost in those places, and are you going to send them to 1-star child care or 5-star child care. Apply your values to what you thought they had, and then have some real information about how much that costs and what that equated to in terms of dollars per hour. So that was also a great exercise that was informative. It put a little reality to our discussion, but it also inevitably brought out people's values as we kind of negotiated with each other. You know, do they get a one-bedroom apartment or do they get a 2-bedroom apartment, etc.
Yeah. John?
So Fritz alluded to basically the next step of the process, and so did Leslie, which was the development of a pretty elaborated set of facts and implications from the facts. And it was, this is obviously a very topical question itself. What is a fact? What's an alternative fact? And we talked a lot about that, and we talked a lot, not just about a series, hundreds really of pages of data, but where do they come from? It's important to remember that you see a document that says from the U.S. Census Bureau or the Consumer Expenditure Survey or whatever, and instead of thinking about all these facts as engraved on tablets, and Moses comes down from the mountain with the tablets and we're supposed to accept the tablets, instead thinking about them all as based upon surveys, having quirks, having margins of sampling error, having limitations to what we can know about things. Even though we have hundreds of pages, there's still questions we kept asking. When it was being presented, and so, well, yeah, but what about this? Well, we didn't know. Yeah. And so part of what that was designed to do was to establish some common level of knowledge. And on a topic like poverty or income mobility, it's particularly important for the different people in the room who had different beliefs or notions or preconceived views to see some of what they believe represented in the data. In other words, if you think that the lack of stable families and family formation and children growing up in single-parent families is a big part of the explanation of chronic poverty, then you in that room saw a lot of data that was consistent with your theory. There was a lot of information that suggested that. However, if you thought that the basic problem had to do with the quality of jobs available, so perhaps it isn't that families don't form, moms and dads don't get married, and so there's a cycle of poverty. Maybe the lack of jobs available, particularly for the potential husbands, made the prospect of marriage less attractive. In other words, the family formation is not causing the economic woes. The economic woes is causing the family formation. Well, you could see that in the data too, because we had data about the changing nature of jobs and what they paid, and how you've got a significant growth in relatively low-paying jobs and a significant growth in relatively high-paying jobs, but it's not as much growth in the middle. And so establishing a common fact base, not that we all agreed on what all the facts meant, but at least that there were such things as facts that come from sources that we are all going to accept as more or less authoritative, is an important point. We were doing this, remember, during 2016, an election year, and I observed this a couple of different times, including this week, but it was really striking how economic facts were in play during 2016. If you were following the national debate, the presidential debate, you'd have a monthly job report come out, and the folks who were on the Democratic side or who were in favor of Secretary Clinton would say, see, look at how far the unemployment rate has dropped and all this job creation. And the Republicans would respond by saying, these numbers don't really mean that. There are all these people that are out of the workforce and not being counted. And the real unemployment rate is much higher than it appears. And so the Obama administration doesn't get credit for that. It's really kind of a fake news. And then we would see the same job report come out in North Carolina. There's a national report and then the state data come out a couple of weeks later, 3 weeks later, and the roles were completely reversed. And the Republicans said, you know, these are really good data. They show the unemployment rate has dropped, and we've had all these jobs. And the Democrats said, no, it's all fake. It's obscuring the fact that the real unemployment rate is 10%, it isn't 5%. And what that illustrates, of course, is that, by the way, the statements that I just said are all arguably correct. There was a significant decrease in the unemployment rate in North Carolina and the nation. But it doesn't tell the full story because of people who aren't in the labor force for a variety of reasons. And so it wasn't that these stories were all fake, they weren't fictitious. They were different glosses or different interpretations of the same set of data, clearly motivated by one's partisan interest at the time. The Democrats wanted to downplay economic strength in North Carolina, the growth of the North Carolina economy, and celebrate the national economy. The Republicans wanted to do the reverse. So we were trying, at least subtly, to work against that by getting to a place where we all accepted that the sources of data were as authoritative as can be, and that different readings of the data are where the issue comes, and that it's not that one reading is absolutely right and one side is fake and partisan, that you can make arguments for different interpretations.
I mean, I think one of the striking things that came out of this was that as you can hear, we presented a lot of data. We blasted people with data. It was a tremendous amount of information. But I think one of the things that came out of it, in fact, we surveyed people on this, that we actually had agreement on a wide range of facts, and lots of things mattered. And I think a subtext of that was people recognizing this is pretty complicated. You know, and there's truth to that, and there's truth in that. And so rather than have your own simple story about what's going on, I think in the end, one of the things I do think came out, we surveyed people who were part of this, it came out of this is that people understood the complexity of this to a greater extent than before.
And I think everybody learned facts that they thought were relevant that they didn't know before.
So
everybody's picture got painted in a little more fine detail than they came away with.
And more than the primary colors. You got a lot of shades and interesting hues in there.
I think a lot of times we go into these kind of debates, and you've heard the phrase, if we would just do X, there's sort of some. I think one of the perhaps the findings of this is there's no just single X in this. It is complicated, and to the extent that people recognize that's a good thing. I'd ask earlier, let me draw you out a little bit on the Chatham House rules aspect of this. We set that up for the reason that we wanted people to speak freely. We're concerned about often I'll let you answer the question rather than me answering the question. Why, John? We actually, it's interesting. We've had prior discussions about this. Why did it matter, and when, and to what extent didn't it matter in terms of the dynamics of the group?
Well, keep in mind that this group had a lot of people in it who are in public life today. They're serving in state or local office right now, or they used to, and they still have a lot of influence and sway, or they're involved in, like I am, in public policy debate. In other words, the stakes aren't low. If you say something and it can be easily taken, that 10 seconds can be taken out of the 30 seconds and then blasted through social media, it could influence, it could damage your reputation. It could lead people to believe that you believe something you don't. We were talking at the very beginning about one of the probable causes of the incivility and the coarseness and weakness of our dialogue is the role that the internet and social media have played in changing the way we consume information. So we don't all read the same newspaper, we don't all listen to the same radio or watch the same TV shows. And so we don't have, we can cocoon ourselves in worlds in which all we hear is a series of self-reinforcing, self-affirming insights. Of course, we also know that the internet is a wonderful tool, including for political discourse, that we can find things immediately that we couldn't previously find. We could find some ideas that are a little bit more fringe out there, but maybe in the three networks and PBS world didn't get much attention. And you can go find them, within a few seconds. Actually, Leslie and I were finding something interesting. I spotted a series of Rudyard Kipling books on the shelf over there. They were published in 1922. And I was struck as I looked at the spine and then on the front of the book that swastikas are very prominently displayed next to his name, next to the images. Now, remember that in 1922, what the swastika was about was it was allusion to Hindu culture. It hadn't been expropriated by these German kooks yet. So the symbol means something very differently on that book when it's published than we look at it today and go, what? But I could quickly look up on my phone immediately and figure out within a couple of minutes the time frame and why that happened. So we all know that the tools that we have online are tremendous, including social media tools, but they have negative consequences. And one of those negative consequences is this potential to be taken out of context. You can take a little hook out of something, a sentence or a clip, and you can blast it and you can really hurt somebody's reputation. And so the Chatham House rule doesn't mean that we can't tell you, as we have, the substance of the conversations and where it went, but we're trying to avoid sticking names on it so that people will actually say interesting things and maybe try out ideas they're not quite sure about. That's part of what we were trying to explore. Encourage people to, the analogy we like is you see something in the store window and you sort of like the color, but you're not sure it will ever fit you, and so you just keep on walking. And our indication is no, go inside, ask for the garment, put it on, look in front of the mirror. You might still decide it doesn't fit you, but you will have actually tried it on first. Well, when it comes to ideas, we have to be in a position to be able to try on some different ideas, some new ideas, some challenging ideas. And maybe we're going to discard them at the end, but we're going to play with them first. We're going to kind of move around and see how the shoes fit. And if all of that's happening in a very public environment, you're going to feel like you look silly and you won't do it.
Let me draw you out on that idea. So, in part, we were worried at the outset about making sure that there was all this stability. We got plenty of stability, probably more than we even needed. But I'm wondering, to John's point, one of the things that struck me, that there were some conversations that did surprise me. There were conversations, that I wish you could have heard of. We can't report between people who had different views, who actually had very interesting exchanges across the table. So the question really is, to what extent did that kind of thing happen, where people tried on other ideas and at least, even if they didn't adopt them, at least seemed to listen in a way that they that have been difficult in other settings.
So John sort of described the Chatham House rules from the perspective of the people who are in public office now or in positions of some power or prominence. But there were also people in the room that weren't in power or prominence and who were dependent on being able to go persuade people who are in power. So for them, it was a different kind of vulnerability of speaking their truth without fear that it would get used against them the next time they needed to go to the General Assembly and lobby for something or ask for something. So I think that was a different aspect of it. When I went into this, I was really afraid that things would explode. And we had a wide array of opinionated people in the room, and I almost thought I should bring my mop with me. But that didn't happen at all. We're all Southerners and we know how to be polite. It turns out that being polite can also be a shield against being candid, and that it was more of a challenge to get people to be forthcoming, not so much about what they thought, but what their assumptions and values or experiences were underneath those ideas that led them to them. So one of the surprising things was that our informal, unplanned conversations probably were more successful in enabling those conversations than the exercises and planned conversations were. I don't know, those of you in North Carolina people, Jack Hunt, who used to be in the legislature, and his daughter Judy also was in the legislature. Jack and his wife used to invite a bipartisan group for dinner at their house while the legislature was in session. And it was just like a nice home, you know, no slings and arrows in the room kind of event. So they called up and said, we read in the paper that you're doing this. We'd like to invite your group for dinner. And about 15 of us showed up, and they had good home-cooked pan beans and biscuits and such, and it was really a wonderful night. So we did some more of those dinners, and that was one thing we didn't plan that enabled people to open up. This idea of breaking bread together really does take down people's guard. I think what we need to work on, though, is how we build this process in a way that more frequently gets people deeper.
And that process has continued informally. We had some group dinners, but I mean, I've had several one-on-one meetings with some of the participants afterwards just to get to know each other better. I understand that's happening in other parts of the state from the participants. Now, as Fritz alluded to, this project by itself cannot, with the direct participants, even over several years, cannot dramatically change the discourse, even in North Carolina per se, because you don't get to enough scale. So we're hopeful that this kind of interaction, this kind of project will be replicated, will be borrowed from as we go forward. So additional kinds of community activities, community forums, community discussions, programs that put people in a room who disagree will come out of this. And really the people who participate in it will be our best ambassadors as we go forward.
I want to open up in a second, but let me just press before we go out and you know, proselytize for the virtues of this and encourage others to do it. Maybe get each of you to say just a couple of words about it. In the end, what do you think we accomplished in this? I mean, if all we did is have some nice dinners, it was great. I certainly learned a lot about the issues, and I made some new friends. But what do you know, if you, at the end of the day, you know, we've now persuaded some foundations to give us some more money, but what is the case for doing this? What did we really accomplish before we persuade others to do similar things?
Well, as Leslie was getting at earlier, it is simply contrary to human nature to personally attack people to the extent that it becomes less likely that you feel comfortable doing that as you know them personally. It's easier to attack. That's why it's easier to go online anonymously and really attack people. But even putting your name on it's easier when you're attacking somebody you don't know personally. So as you build more personal relationships, it isn't that you're going to then agree on everything. You're just not going to make all your disagreements personal. We were talking about technology, and another way to think about it is that you can go online to YouTube or somewhere right now and you can find these fascinating clips from firing line from the 70s or the 80s. Bill Buckley is on with John Kenneth Galbraith, and these are people who disagree quite strenuously about most things, but it's a fascinating, friendly, mini, certainly probing each other, but you could tell that it was never going to get personal and vicious between the two. And we know that technology has changed the TV market in such a way that you don't have free networks and PBS, and so maybe you don't have as many people who watch shows like that, but at least the technology allows you to go back and see what it was like. Well, our goal is not so grandiose as to hope that one day everyone will sit around and talk to each other like Bill Buckley and John Kenneth Galbraith. But in a sense, what we are getting at is that even though you can romanticize the past, it really was the case in the not too distant past that people could disagree very strongly with each other about important issues and not call each other names and make it personal and make it sort of bad insult comedy. A reflection of the passing of Don Rickles, who was good insult comedy. So I think we had some of that from this first session. I think people felt more comfortable arguing with each other as opposed to bickering with each other, which is an important distinction. And I think going forward, if we measure the the success of programs like this according to how often people disagree, how often they agree, and how much more common ground we can build. We're misstating the nature of the goal. That's fine, by the way. I mean, it's good to find common ground and work on it and solve problems, but it's also good to recognize when you don't have common ground on an issue, but you still share in common a motivation to do the right thing, a motivation to help your community succeed.
Leslie,
so part the same. It turned out that nobody in the room was evil, and we took horns off of everybody. Nobody left the room with horns off. So that was a good thing. I think another thing is that if you go into a policy debate really confident that you know the answer and you are right, it is very hard to do the hard work of finding the piece of common ground that everybody might be able to stand on. But if you think that maybe it's a little bit ambiguous and you're still right, but there are facts on the other side and there are some countervailing concerns, and you still agree what you thought, but it isn't quite so black and white, it is much more likely that you will be able to find that little piece of turf that everybody can stand on for a few minutes to be able to move forward for the people of the state. So I think that happened. That while I don't think people really changed their minds dramatically, and I still believe we should raise the minimum wage, and John still doesn't, and that ain't gonna change. But I think most people, maybe everybody, got a few little cracks in their armor, so that if we actually were a legislative committee, it would have been more likely that we could have found some solutions that were nuanced enough that all of us could live with them.
Well, it's been great having John and Leslie here in residence this week as Keenan Fellows, given them, hopefully, it's given us a chance to really reflect on the experience and hopefully to do it better next time. I do think there's a couple of words that come up along the way in these conversations. One is humility, and this is what you're really talking about, that people are a little more humble and at least entertain the possibility that there's evidence out there that could change their mind, and therefore one was trust. We talked about the extent to which there's an element of trust on the other side. Even if you disagree, you at least respect the motives. You don't imagine the other side as somehow malevolent. Those are they're kind of squishy. Humility, trust, but in a way, democratic system depends on some measure of that, some willingness to fight hard, but then at the end of the day to acknowledge the legitimacy of the other side if they prevail. Maybe to think maybe I'll lose this time, but I'll win next time. That kind of thing. We'll see. Stay tuned, I think, in terms of whether we, in the end, succeed in making an observable difference in the tenor of politics in North Carolina. So far, we've done very well, as you see. Well, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And North Carolina is in microcosm the challenges that the nation faces, and so. I think if we could make a dent in this in North Carolina, then maybe that's an example that others elsewhere might find interesting as well. I do want to, I know we don't have much more time, and I did want to give you a chance to ask John and Leslie questions, anything at all about the who, the what, the where, the how of what happened, or more generally about the tenor of politics in North Carolina. Yes?
I would just like to comment that I think it's very difficult to have civil dialogues amongst ourselves, just the voters, ourselves and everyday citizens, when our own representatives are being very ugly and divisive in their own speech. I hesitate to name names. I was really appalled when I heard the Phil Berger's rebuttal to the governor's inaugural speech, and I thought that was a very good example of using divisiveness as a political strategy, and we see this playing out on the national scene as well. And I think that is driving a real wedge between us, because we tend to follow our public figures and mimic them and think that, and we fall prey to their strategies as well and find that our emotions are being riled. Any comments on that?
I agree with you entirely that people follow social cues of those that they feel as leaders. We were talking earlier, it's a sort of a different context, but the same kind of phenomenon, which is that until the last 18 months or so, on average, the Republican Party in America was the free trade party, more or less. And the Democratic Party was somewhat more skeptical about free trade. Now you have Democratic presidents, and they would be in favor of free trade agreement, but you needed a lot of Republican votes to pass them. In the last year-ish, the Republicans, if you look at the public opinion polls, they've become much more hostile to free trade, much more skeptical about free trade. And that's simply the conformity effect of the presidential nominee was Donald Trump. He used a lot of that language. People don't have really deeply felt opinions about lots of things like this. It's more theoretical for lots of people. So when your leader goes this direction, and maybe your previous leader was over there, but you kind of follow your leader. It could be on an issue, and it could be about discourse. And the example that you gave is interesting, because I think if Phil Berger was here and you asked him, why was your response to the governor so pointed and so defending your record, he would say, well, right, because I'm responding to these constant attacks on me and my caucus that have been going on for 4 years, completely unfair. I don't get a lot of opportunity to respond. I knew this response would get attention, so I'm going to respond to all these nasty, vicious personal attacks on me and on the Republicans and what they say we did versus what we think we actually did. So he would justify it, I assume, by saying the other guy started it. And everybody does that, right? We all say, well, some dialogue and respect people's opinion. Now, I'm going to respond when because Fritz's people done something to me, so I'm going to respond. And so you've got this cycle. Now, breaking out of the cycle is, of course, the challenge. I personally believe that, look at the way the public is thinking about this. The public is divided. The public is very partisan. We don't have as many swing voters as we used to. So lots and lots, the vast majority of the public is already committed to the R team or the D team. At the same time, significant majorities of the public are critical of both sides. They're critical of the institutions. I was struck this week by this High Point University poll that came out, and it had President Trump's approval not very good. It was in the 30s, and the Republicans had some significant problems with the voters in that poll. But something like 61% of the poll respondents said that Democrats in Congress should be trying harder to work with President Trump. So Trump is not popular in the poll. Most of the voters in North Carolina disapproved of his job performance. And most of the North Carolinians in the poll said the Democrats should be more willing to cooperate with him. And they also said that Trump should be more willing to cooperate with Congress and both parties and so forth. The point I'm making is there is a public hunger for a different style of discourse and a different kind of leadership. Even among people who have strong opinions, who think that Trump is a bad president or think the Democrats are horrible, they still want to see grown-up behavior. There is still a demand for that. So in my view, breaking the cycle, breaking out of the vindictive type of, well, they did it to me first, I'm going to punch back, and at some point we can shake hands, but first I'm going to get the last punch in. Breaking out of that cycle is, I think, in the current crop of politicians, personal advantage. I think they will gain support. People will look at them positively if they take the lead to break out of this box.
So let me draw Leslie out on that, because I know we were talking yesterday, the extent to which there's something structural going on here that makes it difficult for people to do that. I don't know if that's where you were.
I wasn't. But I'll go there, then I'll go to
we've talked about that, and so there's public support that the public says we want everybody to get along and work together. and yet the politics isn't producing that.
So I think some of it is structural in that we have enough congressional districts, enough North Carolina state and Senate and House districts that are essentially non-competitive in the general elections, that the politicians' incentive is all about playing to their primary voters. North Carolina, that isn't true in the statewide elections because we're still a purple, or as I've come to say, a red and blue striped state. But a lot of states are firmly one way or the other, and certainly within even us purple states, a lot of districts are one way or the other. So that is a structural problem. People have the incentive to play to their primaries, not to play to the general. The other thing is that as we have fewer swing voters, as John said, the game has somehow shifted a bit, not to trying to persuade the middle to come along with you, but to energize and get out your base. So those are both, I think, structural things that are pushing this polarization. On a more personal level, I think we do have an opportunity. I may have given up on the current bachelor currently in office, but we do have an opportunity, and I'm saying that in a nonpartisan way. I'm not saying the people that are currently in power. I'm talking about the broad array of them. But we do have an opportunity with the people who are up-and-coming leaders, who are your mayors and city council members and school board members, and the group that the up-and-coming leaders are going to come out of, to teach them these listening and talking and collaborating skills and try to build those habits in them. So I have some optimism on that front. And on an even more personal level, I was probably no less in shock the day after the election than probably everybody in this room was. And I became aware that a person in my synagogue had supported and really worked for the person that I did not vote for. And this was somebody I respected, and I said, okay, I'm just going to go invite this person to tea and not argue with her. I'm just going to listen to her and hear why this person I respect voted and worked for a candidate that I wasn't in favor of. And we don't do that very often. It didn't change my mind even a little bit. But it did, and this was somebody that I couldn't paint as an evil person. And I respect her. I still respect her. And so we do need to do these personal things also, I think, to hopefully collectively make the edges of this grand divide a little fuzzier.
Maybe we could add the word empathy to the list of traits that somehow we want to encourage. Other questions? Yes?
I'd like to expand to the previous question and ask you, you mentioned that parties and the political leaders are more adhering to the primaries and to people of like mind. The fact, I think, in several states, probably North Carolina as well, certainly California, where I come from, has been that in recent years, the number of unaffiliated voters have been increasing. In fact, in some states, it's the majority number now, more than Republicans and or Democrats. How do you jive these two facts together?
So John can give you some better numbers than I can on this, but I think the answer to that is of all these affiliated voters, almost all of them are either Republican or Democrat in their behavior, even if they aren't in their voter registration or their institutional affinity. You might elect.
Yeah, I mean, there are different definitions of swing voter or ticket splitter or something, but I think everybody agrees that it used to be a lot more common. You used to have maybe 25% of the electorate, or even 30 sometimes, who would split their tickets between different parties depending upon the race. And that was true in the South, it was true in the Northeast. Roles were different, but you had a significant number of voters who picked and chose among the two parties. And that number is much, much smaller today. It might be 8% or 9% or 10%. In other words, you might have years ago started out with 35 to 40% of the electorate, then you got to get the rest of the way, and now you start at the 45-yard line. You got to get just a few more yards to get to 51. And so that's happening even as people have de-affiliated. So I think personally the unaffiliated trend, and I'm unaffiliated, I've never belonged to a party. I think that it is part of a broader phenomenon of just, we just don't join things the way we used to. People go to churches but never become members. They just don't join, they don't affiliate themselves in the same way. There's less of a desire to be part of an institution. And yet the strong opinions are there, and arguably, because the two parties have become more ideologically coherent, you don't really have a lot of gypsy moth liberal type Republicans, you don't have very many bold evil conservative type Democrats anymore, so the two parties don't overlap ideologically the way they did in past generations. So the two parties are more distinctive, and the voters are choosing more distinctive brands. But in my view, even in that world, there's a difference between a closely divided electorate and a bitterly divided electorate. It's not the same thing, or at least we ought to fight for one and not the other.
Yeah, you have in the sorting of the electorate that you described, John, now you have almost perfect sorting of the party leaders, and so if you map the members of Congress who used to overlap in space down the two parties, there is no overlap. There's no Democrat who is more conservative, the most liberal Republican. They just don't.
What's interesting about that is that we often talk about this issue in the context of redistricting and gerrymandering, as we should, because it's clearly a factor. But
it's true in the Senate.
But it's true in the Senate, which is not, you don't gerrymander the Senate. It's true in governor's races in some ways. In other words, the polarization is not just because people are in safe districts and they're only playing in there. Or let me put it this way. People have sorted themselves in such a way that even if the maps were neutrally drawn, you would still have large numbers of districts that are not competitive in November.
That's true.
Not as many.
You would not have as many.
Not as many, but you would still have.
That's true in North Carolina, and then you have national sorting as well. Yes?
I was going to ask if you thought that the changing nature of the election and the way that we look at elections has had an impact on that, both the kind of now almost continuous election cycle on congressional and to a degree Senate and now actually presidential looks like. But also the fact that the long-term effect of the direct election of U.S. senators as opposed to selection by state legislatures. If that's turning, the discussion about the removal of the filibuster is that the House or the Senate now reflects the House as opposed to being a deliberative, slow body. And then kind of the final component of that being the nature of the change in the way that personal morality or personal values has come to the fore, really kind of starting with Gary Hart, but that's that kind of moral character fiber value set now plays as important, if not a more important role in selecting a candidate versus their policy decisions or statements.
Doesn't seem to have in this election.
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of find evidence for either side of the proposition that personal behavior and morality is more or less relevant to what voters think. I mean, Gary Hart, for example, got himself in trouble by sort of bragging and daring them to chase him down, as opposed to the many, many politicians who had scandals and affairs that didn't destroy them because they didn't go out and say, "I dare you to catch me in flagrante." But one of the things that is inescapable, I mean, if you look at the history of American politics, and you look at personal attacks in the 1800 presidential elections, you will find them. But the difference is, as you say, this sort of politics is constant. But the elections last for years. As soon as you finish electing a president, people start going to Iowa. That is, I think, fueled by the news cycle and the way we consume information today. We consume things in real time rather than, reading Newsweek the following week when you have a little bit more time to think it through, or maybe your views, your feelings are not as visceral and immediate. Now everything is visceral and immediate. And I think that in some ways, I think that the pretty obvious character flaws of both of the major party candidates in a previous world might have been fatal, but were not, because people are ignorant to them. It's like, if this is okay, then pushing it a little bit further is okay, pushing it a little bit further is okay. As you know, the Clinton administration assumed that running all these ads with clips of Trump saying these horrible things, offensive things, would be a devastating blow. I thought the ads were very effective. In retrospect, it turned out to be a colossal waste of scarce resources, because people already knew that. It wasn't that they didn't know Trump said some horrible things. They had already discounted that in their minds because of something else that they considered to be more compelling.
So I think there's a different thing that has really changed and that is institutional about elections, and that is the amount of money and the amount of money that is invisible. So we don't actually know who's spending it and how they're spending it. And the ability to use social media to get out your message in this micro-targeted way based on these very sophisticated algorithms of figuring out who you can push by saying what. Whether or not what you say to them is true. And the other side probably doesn't even know that you're saying it because it's all kind of invisible. I think that all of that is also very polarizing. That people are fed polarizing rhetoric that somebody has figured out that is what they want to hear. And that then reinforces their already probably somewhat polarized view. And the fact that that's all done completely separately, not in some dialogue, I think is another problem that I'm not the person to figure out how to address it, but I know it's a problem out there.
Turns out it's a multifaceted problem. It's maybe the biggest one facing us. I know I worked in the U.S. Congress in the House and then in the Senate, and at a time, now some time ago, where members did know each other across the aisle and spent some time together. Now, they're literally not in Washington. They don't ever eat together. They're basically visiting Washington and constant, and the campaign is constant, and that's true in the Senate. The old Senate, we don't have to go all the way back to the elections by state legislators, but there was still a sense of it as a deliberative body, somewhat insulated from the politics of the day. We can bemoan certain aspects of that, the kind of smoke-filled rooms. It was obviously not representative in many ways of the society. On the other hand, as we open it up, it becomes more like the House, more attended, more responsive to politics. All of these other things come up, and that's why I do think this kinds of fora where we try to recreate something that existed before, conversations that could take place, relationships they could build, may well be a very important thing to do. Yes?
As somebody that obviously is not a power broker in any way, shape, or form, what I'm hoping to get out of this today is how to go about replicating this on a small scale for people that I do know or don't know necessarily, but maybe close in proximity to where I live. How do I play a role in making such a group happen? Because I do absolutely believe, and then I'm going to plug WRAL. I have developed a real respect for you since I've been watching On the Record on WRAL. I don't even know, I DVR it, so I don't even know what day it's on.
NC Spin probably is what you mean.
No, I don't think they call it NC. They used to.
They're both two shows.
Okay. I think it's On the Record. But anyway, just because it is civil debate and presenting two sides of an issue, and you can, in fact, see some validity on both sides. So how can we do this as, you know, not power brokers?
Well, there are two quick things that Leslie and I have been talking about this week a little bit more, thinking about what seems to work. And there are two things to think about. One of them is sort of obvious, but maybe not so. It has to be a priority. Lots of people say, I wish we could all get along better. And then it's never really a priority. When it all comes right down to it, what they want to focus on is hanging out with their people and getting their people ginned up and raising money and winning the next election or winning the next legislative vote or whatever it is. So it has to become an actual priority, like I'm going to do this. I'm going to go find someone I disagree with and make a special effort to build a relationship with that person today, right now, not in theory at some point once I retire, you know, but right now. The other piece has to do with, in the process itself, the way that you listen to someone else. And I know I do this because when I started out as a high school and college debater, I'm listening to my opponent. I'm listening simply for vulnerabilities. Okay, he read that really fast case for it, and I'm listening for whether he sort of preempts this argument. Oh, he doesn't. Great, now I got it. That's why I'm listening. I'm listening, looking for the cracks in the armor that I can shoot through. Well, that's a form of listening that has a practical value, but I'm not really learning what that person is trying to convey to me. I couldn't then pretend to be that person in my mind and explain why they believe what they believe, because I'm not really actively listening to that person. I'm really just looking for vulnerabilities. I'm basically sizing someone up. So when you get together with someone who disagrees with you, and your form of listening is in preparation for the rebuttal, that's one kind of, and there are situations where that's appropriate, like if you're trying to win a college debate. Okay. But in the context we're talking about, truly listening so that if prompted, you could explain as if it was your own opinion what that person has just said. That's a form of active listening that I think is more respectful, is more likely to lead to the kind of understanding we're talking about, and is more likely then to be reciprocated when you're prepared to explain your view and why you believe it, that the other person feels like they've been listened to and now they're going to listen to it.
Leslie, do you want to add to that? And I know you've been speaking about that with John.
So a couple of things. We did do a little mini seminar with some undergraduate and graduate master students this week. So we had them for 6 hours, 3 hours a night for 2 nights. And I was surprised in how much impact just spending 6 hours with them of talking about active listening, exposing them to facts they disagree with, getting them to articulate their views and what their assumptions and what was underneath those assumptions to each other. Just 6 hours of that seemed to make a huge difference to these students. Maybe, you know, I'm not patronizing you if you're in here. So I just think we just have to do more of that. It didn't. It's not in our behavior patterns to read the views and opinions of the other side, much less to have any conversation about it. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I don't think we're quite ready, but when we just started doing this, there was just no playbook. There's plenty of playbook for getting to yes negotiations, but this is really something different than that. I don't think we're quite ready to write a playbook, but I hope that we will become ready to develop a playbook that community groups and Chamber of Commerce leadership groups and other groups can use to facilitate these kinds of discussions better. It doesn't mean I think you should wait till we have the playbook and have the discussions, but I do think that that's something in our mind that I don't think we're confident enough yet about how to do it well to write a playbook. But I hope we will get there.
we're certainly get there, or we're trying to get there in terms of leadership forum. I would just say, putting a plug for the center I had, Paulus, this is something we would like to help people do. So if you want to reach out to us, and we can try to facilitate that. We've been doing a number of things here on campus where we have students, something called the Devil's Discourse, where students take with differing views on very difficult issues like abortion, talk to each other in a civil way. And I think the key to that, if I say, is one key is just not to start accusatory. That why would you believe? How could you believe that? But in a sense, it's really asking people their story. Like, tell me about you before you get to that. Tell me about what, because you're really trying to give people respect and to try to understand why they see the world that they do. And if you're willing to give that to somebody, what we know is that people will then are more likely to reciprocate. Whereas if you don't have somebody in an accusatory way, it's really counterproductive. I thought when we talked about this earlier, when we were wrapping up the session, one of the people said about what we were talking about, what did we learn from this process, and he said, I learned how to talk. And what he meant by that is because when everybody was talking about how the importance of listening, but until you listen to somebody and understand, and in some ways at least begin to put yourself in their shoes, you don't know how you sound when you talk to them. And so I think that was an important lesson. So that'll be in the playbook when we get that written. I think we may have time for, I don't know how we're doing on time, but we may have time for one more question here. Yes.
One thing I feel like a lot of us came up in kind of a golden age of where there was a level of stability in politics that I don't think has really been around that long. I mean, I think it was a post-war generation that really created this dialogue. And we got a lot of problems going on right now. One of the things that I see is for everything you're doing here, trying to foster a conversation, there's some very powerful interest groups that want to do the exact opposite. It's in their best interest not to have those. And, I think part of what we have seen happen is parties used to be umbrellas for large organizations. But I'm not one of these people who thinks we can really stop the flow of money in politics. I do think we can direct it. And the way we've directed it right now is we've empowered very narrow interest groups to have an incredible amount of power, which they demonize. They got very specific things they want done. And anybody who's against it, they demonize them. And you even see it within the parties themselves. I mean, last night, after this strike with George Bush, all of a sudden, but all of a sudden, the kind of alt-right is coming after Trump. As I saw more people tweeting, "I'm through with him." What in the world? And we kind of saw the same thing with the HB2 thing here, where there was an ad, and they're attacking the guy they helped get elected over single issues. And what I realized is, and those are just 2 examples. I mean, there are a whole bunch of these groups. It's in their best interest not to foster dialogue. They just want their extreme. My brother and I get in this conversation. He calls it Hegelian.
It is a form of the dialectic.
Yeah,
but of course the dialectic leads to synthesis in Hegel.
Right.
There's a thesis and antithesis, and then a synthesis.
Right, and that's his. He says that it's okay that we got to have these. My argument is, I feel like they've got too much power, and instead of having parties that kind of created an umbrella and a bridge, these organizations, for all intents and purposes, are parties. And
I mean, you're speaking my language on this. We maybe even talked about it before, but I think money will flow, and I'd rather it flow to parties and candidates directly rather than all these independent groups because of the regulatory restrictions that were placed.
Right.
Okay, the money will flow somewhere. You might as well flow it to the most transparent and broadest-based entity. But before we think that this is an impossibly difficult challenge and we'll never really do it, we're all just sort of foolishly, quixotically tilting this windmill. As I said earlier, the public is dissatisfied with what they're being given. So yes, there are some individual groups that thrive on the conflict or the intransigence and even the personal name calling. You know, the crazier you make the letter, the more money you get from the silly donor. I understand all of that. But I truly believe that it is in the interest of the current people in office and people who are getting ready to be the people in office to devise a different form of politics that the public will like better. You could still be very strongly conservative or very progressive, but I think that it would be a better brand for the current political market. I think people who could find a way to lead a conversation that is civil and not like they're all moderates but people have obviously very strong opinions and they're not backing away from their opinions, but they're going to be respectful of the other side. I think the voters will reward that. Of course, I don't run campaigns, you tell me.
So that sounded like a pretty good wind-up for John. Leslie, let me give you a last word here. You maybe a similarly optimistic view of
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I am an optimistic person. So both John and I, from different people, of course, have gotten pressure not to do this. We've been told that you have finite money and energy, and that all of the money and energy needs to get focused on winning, because the other side is bad and we're good. So we've each heard that. I don't think, and John doesn't think, I know, that it's a choice between trying to win and trying to understand. That you don't have to give up trying to win to try to understand. And in fact, in many circumstances, you are more likely to win if you've taken the time to try to understand the arguments and the people that disagree with you. I think that most people kind of intuitively get that. And I'm not Pollyannish in that I don't understand the uphill battle of doing this. But I think people do want it. And I think not only the voters want it, but that most people who want to go into public policy and public office want it. And they want, when they get there, to be able to have an opinion and to have views, but in the end to be able to govern in a way that they think moves the ball forward for the state or city or people that they represent. So I don't think that we're in this forever, but that it will take some work to get us into a different mode of communication and working together that's consistent with the tools, the technology, and communications that we have at hand today.
Well, I think you'll probably all agree that if we had public leaders like Leslie and John, we would, and we can inspire a new generation, perhaps, of leaders like Leslie and John, that we really do have reason to think that we'll turn the tide on this. And so I too am optimistic. Please join me in thanking Leslie.